So our first step really is to set up 3D Studio Max to ensure that we can create as modular tileable texture as possible. So let's jump straight in, and at the top of the toolbar you'll see a Customize tab. If we click on that and scroll down to Unit Setup, click on that, we have a little dialog box that pops up. It lets us set our own units for our project. Today we're going to be using metric, and we're going to be using centimeters especially. We're going to be using this for a couple of reasons, which I'll explain in a second. So just select metric and click OK. And our second step is to customize our snaps. Now, snaps within 3D Studio Max is going to become very important later on during the process, and also in creation of modular pieces for environments, making sure that all these pieces fit together, a little bit like Lego, just to ensure that we've got as clean bake as possible. So if we scroll to the top, just beneath the Customize tab, we have a Snaps toggle. If we right click on that, it brings up another dialog box, and this is basically all of the options for our snaps within 3D Studio Max. We have 4 tabs along the top: Snaps, Options, Home Grid, and User Grids. We're going to be using the first 3 in this tutorial. So under our Snaps tab, we have grid points, and these are all the different options we can have, and snap to within Max. We will be using grid points. We're also going to be using vertexes. So we're going to be snapping vertexes to grid points to ensure that everything fits correctly. So that's it for the snaps tab. So we can move along to options. And here we have a lot of options open to us. For now, all we're going to tick is the snap to frozen objects, which will become a little bit more apparent later on, and the enable axis constraints, which we'll talk about as well. So just select these 2 options for now, and we'll move on to the home grid. So with the home grid, by default, using the 3D Studio Max units, this is set to different values. So now we're using centimeters, we're going to set it to our own values. The grid spacing is basically these squares, the size of these squares. So we're going to set this to 64 centimeters. We're going to set our major lines to 10. We're going to keep that default. And the perspective view grid extent, which is basically how far this grid extends, we're going to set that to 20. So we basically have, if we close that second, this is all we need this for. So if we close that, if we zoom out, we can see that we've got 20 64 by 64 boxes on either side of our grid. And this is going to be really important for creating a mesh that fits and making sure that we can actually visualize snapping to the grid and objects to that grid. So now we've got that set up, we've got our unit set up, we have our snap set up, and we're going to move straight on to the creation of our first mesh, which is going to be our target mesh for baking. So if you head over to the right hand side of the screen with the create panel and select plane, just drag out a plane. We're going to set the length to 2048 and the width to 2048 too. So this is 2048 by 2048 centimeters, not general units. So although this isn't the same power of 2 that we use within Photoshop, that's in pixels, it still gives us a really good indication of being able to divide objects and making sure that they fit to a grid mathematically as well as visually. So we're going to keep that 2048 by 2048. If we right click and select our move tool, down at the bottom here you can see that we've got the X, Y and the Z coordinates for the object itself. If we set this to 0, so we can either number in 0 on all 3, or you can right click these little arrows, this is going to place our object right in the center of world space. This is really important to ensuring that our bake is consistent and making sure that we're not leaving any gaps. If we press T to go into a top view and zoom into a corner, we can see that the mesh is actually lined up on the grid perfectly, and the grid actually divides our mesh up into 64 by 64 squares. So that's really important, and that's exactly what we want. Okay, so jump back into a perspective view. Now, personal preference really, I like to change the color of meshes to black, and I like to put a grey material on top of it. So just the default material, head into modes. If you see this when you start up, just head over to modes, compact material editor, and you'll get the material balls up. Just drag one of those over to the mesh, and now you can see that it has a black wireframe or has a grey color to it. I just find this easier to work with for shading purposes, and also just make sure everything looks as it should really. 15 different colours on the screen kind of distracts me sometimes, so just having the one colour with the black wireframe really helps me visualise. Okay, so if we just drag this below the grid for a moment, we're going to freeze our mesh. Now, if we right click and we just click on freeze selection, we can't click it anymore, so we can't move, which is what we want. But this also means that we can't affect the snap of objects around it at the moment as it is. So if we right click and unfreeze all, if we click on the object itself, right click on the object, sorry, and click on object properties, we get a few more options to deal with. So under interactivity, we can actually freeze the object from here as well. But we also want to untick show frozen in grey, and this just lets us see the wireframe as well, rather than just having that grey colour surrounding it. It's not hugely important, again, it's just a personal preference. It just does help me visualise things a lot better sometimes. Okay, so we have our base mesh created. So this is our plane, this is what we're actually going to bake the normal map to. But we need to create some detail now. So if we grab the box tool, box subobject tool, sorry, and if we just drag a box out, any size will do for now. Okay, so there's our first box. Now if we go to our Modify tab, we'll see how length, width and height. Now we need this length really and the width to match up with our grid. So this is 2048 by 2048. So half of 2048 is 1024, so we want our width to be 1024. You can see that change in the viewport. Our length. Now obviously these are all 64 by 64 units, or centimeters, sorry. These are grid points, which means our mesh technically could be divided up into segments of 64. So as this is snapped to the grid, and as we want our meshes to snap to the grid to create a tileable normal, we're going to use divisions by the power of 2 for our objects, and for our tileable objects as well. So this base mesh is 2048 by 2048. We're going to ensure that this is also sticking to those power of 2 dimensions. So 1024 is power of 2. The length we also want to be 256. So basically what that means is if each one of these squares is 64, 2 of them is 128 and 4 of them is 256. So if we press T to go into our top view again, and if we actually click on our snaps toggle, you'll see that we can start to visualize these snaps between vertices and grid. So this yellow crosshair indicates all the snap points to our actual grid, and if we hover over a vertice, we can actually see that it's got the yellow crosshair over that too. One thing that we also tick when we right clicked and looked at our snap options, under our options panel, we clicked on enable axis constraints. Now that's really important. If we untick that for a second and we try and move our object, we can see that it doesn't really conform. So if we try and drag in the x-axis, it just drags along all three. Of course we're going to see 2 at the moment, but it's dragging along all 3. If we enable axis constraints, you'll see that the widget for the move tool changes, and we're able to actually highlight individual axes. So we can just drag along the x-axis. That's why that's really important. You'll also notice that we tick the snap to frozen objects, so we can actually snap to this object rather than just the grid to make sure that we're getting some exact snap into our original mesh as well as the grid. And this is just to ensure that the bake of the normal is fitting within the dimensions of our base mesh. Okay, so we can close that. And we can move our mesh, and we want to snap the vertice to this vertice at the top left. And as you can see, it snaps to the grid perfectly. 256, again, 64, 64, 64, and 64. We can see that it's 4 squares in length, and it's also half of our mesh in width. The height doesn't really matter for now, but we'll set it to 64 anyway, just to keep power 2. We don't need it too tall, it's not going to really matter that much. So we'll just keep it down with 64. Okay, so here's our original box. Now I'm going to change the colour of this and add a material to it as well. Like I said, just prefer personal preference. And I'm going to hold down Shift and drag out a copy in the X-axis. And as you can see, it's snapping already to the grid, which is really good, but I'm going to manually place this. So I'll just snap it out for a little bit. I want to create an instance. we're creating an instance because we want to affect all of these objects at once. We don't want to create copies and have to go through the same process for each part of our baked normal. So we're just going to choose instance for now. And if I zoom in, I can actually drag the vertice to the grid point. So we've got the first part of our tileable texture done. The next part is to drag a copy down. So it's the same process, and we're going to drag up to this vertice. Now we want to create a tileable texture with a little bit of character in it, looking at kind of a laminate floor. So we want to really emulate how laminate flooring is laid. So really we need this right in the middle of our mesh. And we can see here that it snaps quite nicely. We just need to make sure that the number of squares on this side, number of grid squares, is equal to that, just to ensure that it's actually in the center. This is in the center, as we can see in the x-axis, it's at 0, 0 centimeters, which is great, that's what we want. So in this axis, it's in the center. So same process, we're just going to drag a copy out, instance, and then move and snap. And we're going to do the same for this side as well. Instance, and then snap. Okay, so we've got this part of our mesh. Now the reason that we froze our original mesh is because we're moving quite a lot of things and we're instancing a lot of things. The last thing we want to do is move our mesh, our original base mesh that we're going to bake to. So if we leave this frozen, we can actually select all of our objects and copy them and move them and whatever we need to do. So it's just a little safer than having to zero this in every time we make a mistake. So we have our 5 original reference meshes here. If we just drag a copy of this down as well, we can just select one of these vertices and snap it to this bit of the grid. So we've actually got half of this done now, and if we select that, we can get all of it done by dragging down a copy again, and then just snapping this back to the grid. So there we go. So there's our complete base mesh underneath, as well as all the reference objects that we're actually going to use for baking on top. So we just need to choose one of these meshes for now to make the alterations to. So I'll select one in the center at the bottom and make sure that we convert it to an editable poly. This is something that I should have done before actually. So all of these referenced items is a good point. All of these referenced items will remain references, but they will not be editable polys, which is exactly what we don't want. So actually we're going to have to do that process over again. So if I delete everything apart from our editable poly, and I'm just going to go quickly and make sure that I'm instancing these out. It's good practice to do this, and sometimes everybody makes mistakes. Luckily that this is quite a fixable mistake. So again, same process, we're just going to be dragging this down to the grid, making sure that we're not leaving any gaps, so everything fits nicely together. And it does, we're using the grid, so we can see this yellow crosshair as before on the grid. We can also snap to vertices, so we're actually getting no gaps here, so we're good to go. Okay, so all of these are now instanced editable polys, which is what we should have done at the beginning. So if we make alterations to one of these now, every single one of these will be affected, and that's exactly what we want. So if I select this one at the bottom again and hold down Alt and press Q, I can isolate that selection. So this just lets me work on one of these meshes without having to worry about visualizing the rest of it. I'm going to make a few alterations to this mesh, and it will affect all the others as well. So up on the right hand side here, I have all of my buttons preset for my modifiers. I'll use the list for this just so you can see what it is I'm actually selecting. So if we click on our modifier list and scroll down to chamfer, I believe this is in 2015 onwards, I'm not sure about 2014, but we can easily select all of the edges and chamfer that way. This is just an easier and quicker way to do it. You'll see that it gives us a couple of options on the right hand side. On the amount, I'm going to change that to 3.5. Change that to 5 actually, just to give it a little bit more of an edge. Once we've done that, you'll see that it's in the modifier stack. So on top of that, I'm just going to include an edit poly. And the reason that I'm including edit poly and not collapsing and then altering the original is because this is non-destructive. So if I need to make any changes, or I need to take away edges or just completely delete it, I can just delete this modifier and it won't affect the original mesh. Whereas if I didn't do that, I would have to manually go in there and take out the edges, and it just takes a long time. So we have our edit poly modifier. Now usually for high poly workflow, I will add segments in here to make sure that it's as square as possible on the surface. But for the purpose of this, we're not going to be taking it to ZBrush, we're not going to be sculpting it at all. So we're not going to worry about the segments, we'll keep that for a separate video. So just to make sure that these edges do deform properly, we're going to come into our modeling tools and select Swift Loop. And this just allows us to add in sections, or cross sections should I say, using an edge tool rather than the connect. And it's just a quicker way of visualizing these edges. So those are my supporting edges set up. So if we apply Turbo Smooth, I'll just give it a couple of iterations, we can see that these edges are a little bit smoother. Might be able to just include one more there just to give that a bit of a show. Okay, so now we've sorted that one. All we do is click the little light bulb at the bottom, and everything has been applied to all of our instances. And that's really powerful in the fact that we don't need to go and do this manually to every single sub-object, which is really, really time consuming. So this has pretty much done it for us. So as you can see, we have our tile set up here. These are our reference meshes, which we're actually going to be grouping together in a second. And we also have our base mesh here. So the next step really is to prepare these meshes for xNormal. Now, before we start the rest of the tutorial, you want to make sure that you have xNormal installed. So if you go to the xNormal website, xnormal.net, click on the downloads, you can see that there's plenty of downloads to Windows installed. They don't have this for Mac just yet, so it is Windows only, but it's a really good tool, and we'll be using it a little bit in the next part of the video to create a simple normal map instead of using the default Max Baker. Okay, so this object is still frozen. We can turn our snaps off by pressing S or just clicking that button. So this is still frozen, we can't select it, we can't move it. So the next step really is to unfreeze it. So if we right click and choose unfreeze all, we can now select it and we can drag it above our objects. Now this is still plain, we haven't converted it to a poly yet, so if we right click and convert to an editable poly, in terms of unwrapping, if we just click and unwrap UV, just real quick so we can visualize what I'm talking about. We don't really need to do much to this, to be honest. It's supposed to be a tileable texture, so we want it to be touching each edge of the UV space. So this grey square, we want it to be touching the edges of that to make sure that the texture is seamless. So we can leave this as it is and right click and collapse to on the edit poly modifier stack. So we have this set up. We just need to name this now. So if we just name this texture reference underscore low. So that's our low poly mesh named and sorted. And if we just grab all of our high poly meshes, click on group, and then we group these, we can just name this high poly meshes for now. Okay, so that's fine. So really we're ready to go. All we need to do is export both of these objects and then bake them in xNormal. So if we right click, one thing we need to do before we export this plane is convert it to an editable mesh. The low poly meshes for xNormal only really work if we export them as SBM files, which is xNormal's default importer for low poly meshes. So if we right click and convert to editable mesh, this will set it up nicely for use in xNormal. So editable mesh, and then we click on our modifier list, and we want to attach a projection modifier to this. So projection modifier basically allows us to project detail from our high poly meshes to our low poly plane. So we get all of the detail for these lines and these segments here on our low poly. So we've included our projection modifier. That's okay as it is for now, as long as we just make sure that we tick the cage option, which is usually ticked by default on the right hand side, and we're ready to export this. So with it selected, if we just click on the max button, export, and export selected, make sure that you're in a file location that is suitable. I've set up this little project here with an exports folder. The save as type file is xNormal SPM exporter, so it is, should be installed into 3D Studio Max once xNormal is installed. So if we click that and just name this Tileable low. So once we click on that, we get this little dialog box, and it gives us some preset options. All we're going to tick is the low definition mesh, and then that's our options for us. And we click export. It'll tell us when it's been done successfully, and we just close the exporter. Okay, so that's done. So if we click on our high poly group, and again go to max, export, export selected. We're not going to save it as an SPM. We're going to save it as an OBJ, so an object exporter. I'm going to save this as Tileable high. So we've got our low, we've got our high poly. We're going to save that, export this, that's fine. It might take a little while to export given the number of objects we got. Okay, once that's done, just click the done button, and we're ready to go into xNormal. Okay, so this is the window that we get when we first load up xNormal. We have our options down the right hand side here. So we've got high definition meshes, low definition, baking options, fine detail, tools, 3D viewer, settings and examples, and support. Today we're only going to be using the high definition, low definition, and baking options. So if we click on high definition meshes, this is where we import our high poly object. All we need to do is right click on this blue line and add meshes. Now we need to go to our export folder and choose the high polymesh, and you'll see that's imported even. So our low definition meshes, we right click and add meshes again, and now we can choose our low polymesh. Now on the right hand side with our low polymesh, we want to make sure that the cage is used. So click on your object and use cage, and that should be fine. Under our baking options, we want to choose the output file. This is where our normal map's going to be being saved. So if we click this little green button here, it takes us to our folder. So bakes, this is where we have that. So in our bakes folder, I'm going to call this Tileable 01. Now we don't have to worry about putting underscore normals after this as a name, because that saves automatically. So a name like this is fine. Try not to include an underscore after the name, because that will interfere with xNormal's exporting. So just make sure that it's a solid character afterwards. That's fine. Click on save. And we're pretty much ready to go. We're only going to be baking the normal map in this instance. We're not going to worry about ambient occlusion. We're going to be taking care of that in the next tutorial in Quixel's Endo. So all we really need is the normal map for now. 2048 by 2048 is fine. However, we're going to be using 4096 by 4096. The reason we're doing that is because we want to work with as high a resolution as we can, so we can take that quality down if we need to, and also use it at a higher resolution if we need to. For a tileable material, it's probably unlikely that we'll need 4096 by 4096, but given that the Quixel Suite, Endo, and Dido, they work at 4096 by default, we're going to leave it at that for now, and worry about minimizing the file sizes later on. So we have our output file ready. This is where it's going to be saved to. We have our sizes ready. We've got a normal map, maps to render button ticked. Everything else we can pretty much leave as default for now. We don't need to worry too much about that. And click the generate maps button at the bottom, and it will generate our normal map for us. So this may take some time depending on the size of the map that we're exporting, and also the complexity of the objects within the map itself. This one's relatively simple, so it's not taking a huge amount of time. Once it is done, you'll see a map generated message at the bottom, and we can just close this. And that's our normal map done. So if we navigate to our folder, our bakes folder, and we double click, it will open up in Photoshop for us, and we can now see our normal map that's been created. So the next stage in this is to take it into Endo and Dedo and start working on a material for this normal map and making sure that it tiles correctly across multiple meshes. I'll see you in the next video.